Hello, I'm Matthew Hopkinson from the local data company, and today we held our third Openings and Closures Summit, courtesy of Hogan Lovells in London. We had a great panel which consisted of Matthew Ditchburn from Hogan Lovells, who works with a number of retailers and their property portfolios. We had Professor Paul Longley from University College London. We had Simon Danczuk, who's the MP for Rochdale, but also the chair of the all-party parliamentary group of small shops. And then we also had Hussein Lalani, the co-founder of 99p Stores, over 200 stores that they've now got. And then also finally, Michael Weedon from the British Independent Retailers Association. It was led by Samantha Fennick of the BBC. So a really interesting mix and discussion emanated from that. Because during the first half of this year, we've seen nearly 45,000 openings and closures. And what is significant is we've seen the continued decline of the chain retailers and the continued, albeit smaller, growth of the independents. So the independents are very much alive and well. They're very much a key part of town centres. But an interesting point that lots of people picked up on is, have we reached the peak of this growth? Because we've seen it come down and come down. And whilst we've seen the multiple decline arrested in 2013, we're seeing it start to move up significantly. So in the first half of 2014, we've seen more net closures of chain retailers than we did for the whole of 2013. But it's got, which is over 400, but we've got some way to go before we hit the peak, which was 2012, of nearly 1,800 net closures. So some of the other topics that came out, which are very interesting, is about this stability, or lack of stability, or the fluidity of the high street. And this is both emanated now across shopping centres, across retail parks, in and out of town. Because 10, 15 years ago, we were on the 25-year leases, then we were talking about 10. But actually what was becoming very clear from yesterday is we're looking at sort of 3 to 5 year leases. And that has a significant impact for the investment market, which I hasten to add currently is incredibly hot. There's a lot of money chasing space, and obviously the big question is, will there be any rental growth? There's talk of rental growth, but I'm not entirely convinced that we'll see it coming from anywhere. We also looked at the fact, well, why is all this change? So Professor Longley made some interesting points about the change in settlements, the change of catchments, and this is something we're working with the universities on as to how we can analyse that and create better catchments and understanding of what's happening. And Hussein Lalani was very interesting, talking about 99p Stores and was talking about being positioned in a certain town in the southeast and then actually the whole of that town moving, and he's now got to uproot and move again with everyone else, following the herd, as he said. So big issues there, big costs, and it's a pain to them financially on their side, the fact that the town has moved on to a different area. And then lastly, we came back to the age-old question about business rates and the impact that has. And obviously Simon Danczuk knows this well from Danczuk's Deli in Rochdale, as does Hussein. But I think that an interesting point was made that perhaps it's not about uniform change everywhere. Should it be a bit more about identifying locations that need more help? And Simon talked about that with regard to Rochdale. Should there be powers for councils to raise business rates, not just to lower them, and therefore create an imbalance? But ultimately, it came back to the point of, are the councils best positioned or best informed to be able to do this? Because at the end of the day, we've seen lots of changes, and actually in many council instances, and we see it here at the local data company, there's a lack of knowledge, there's a lack of insight as to what should be happening. And at the end of the day, everyone can't compete to the death. There's got to be a much wider plan to understand that if that town builds that shopping centre, there's no point us just trying to build another shopping centre to compete, because at the end of the day, you just spread that spend, they become economically unviable, and the retailers know that, and they move away. So all in all, a really good event, and I hope you enjoy the panel reviews. There are also copies of the report that summarise all of this. And we look forward to running our next event, which will be in Edinburgh in December, and then seeing you all again for our next round of vacancy and occupancy summits, which will be held in February, March next year. And I'm delighted to announce that we'll be holding our first Welsh summit as well in 2015 in Cardiff. Thank you.
The latest report by the LDC on openings and closings on the high street tells us that change, which is not necessarily visible on the high street itself day by day, is dynamic. It's still with us, and in fact it's increasing in speed all the time. It shows that the composition of our high streets is changing as some sorts of shops close down and others open up. It's real change, and it's interesting that this is really only visible. This collection of data brought together makes visible something which is really not visible when you're on a high street. It's a bit like, I would I would characterize it like an MRI scanner for the economy in this country. You only actually see the changes when you bring this data together and analyze it, and that's what LDC bring to this particular area. What these figures tell us about whether the country is coming out of recession or not is very mixed, I would say. What they tell us is that multiple shops are generally closing down. They're getting rid of units, especially where they're concentrating more on their internet businesses, whereas small shops are opening up more and more. But the interesting thing about them is it's what is opening up, and increasingly it's service and leisure-based shops rather than those which sell finished goods at the end of worldwide supply chains. It's things where people benefit from being within a particular location. They're standing in a shop. A haircut will be a good example. Of course, you'd be sitting in a shop there. Not necessarily the same thing if at 11 o'clock at night you're buying a pair of shoes on Amazon. Whether it tells us whether we're coming out of recession or not, no, I don't think it tells us that. It tells us about the underlying changes in the high street, but well worth it just for that.
I think this report's a fascinating springboard for understanding what's going on the high street and helping us to understand the diversity of outcomes. And so I think we in the research community really look forward to working with local data company and other partners who are producing this evidence-based analysis of high street outcomes to understand things like how the high street can contribute to the health of our towns and cities, how the report can contribute to our understanding of multimodal shopping, the way that more and more people are moving online, the way that the way that in our towns and cities we're moving about more. So our convenience culture at the level of individual cities, and the way that we move about between different cities in every aspect of our daily lives. And so in response to the third of the questions that you've asked, I think the figures provide an evidence base, a platform for our understanding these salient issues which will increasingly come to define the way that we think about our towns and cities.
Well, I'm interested to read this latest report from the local data company. What I think it shows is that whilst we have a real growth in independent retailers, which I'm really pleased about, we're also losing quite a lot of them. So there's a lot of churn in terms of independent retailers on our high street, and I think that should provide some cause for concern. It's a loss of jobs, it's a loss of people's incomes, it's a concern for those that have got directly involved in our high streets. It's important that we collect this data so that government can learn from it, both at a national level, so we can devise policies that can address these concerns, not least business rates, but also energy prices. And it's also important at a local government level, because we also need councils to take a clearer role in terms of developing and enhancing their high streets. So the data itself is very important, and we can learn a lot from it, and I'm sure we will continue to do that as the local data company goes from strength to strength.
Hussein Lalani, Commercial Director at 99p Stores. I think the latest report from the LDC does show us that the high street continues its evolution. This period of evolution started at about the time of the credit crunch, and now it continues. And now we see consumers are more interested in local stores again and less interested in big out-of-town developments. I think it also shows that our town centres and high streets are not just centres for retail, but also centres for other important parts of everyday life. in terms of the importance, I think it's very important that LDC capture this data. And this data is extremely useful to people like myself, to retailers, to town planners, to planners who are building schools or hospitals or any other community service. I think these reports and the data they capture shows us the state of our towns and our high streets and our cities, and helps us plan big developments. I think the figures that are being published at the moment, and the figures being published more broadly, do show that the economy is getting stronger and is on its way to recovery. But I think we still have a long way to go before we can truly say we're back to normal, whatever normal is. Perhaps this is the new normal. And I think the major factor which really has to catch up is in terms of wages. I think wages have pretty much remained stagnant over the past 5-6 years. However, inflation has continued to rise. Therefore, actual money in the average person's pocket is less. Until we start seeing more disposable income in consumers' pockets, I don't think we can truly say we've come out of the recession.
I think this local data company report gives us a really useful insight into what's happening out there on the high street. And broadly, it's good news. It shows that the number of independent retailers has grown again, and that's great. But the question is that good news good enough? Yes, the independents are growing, but should they be growing at a faster rate now? We're meant to be at a really good point in the cycle, but the rate of growth seems to be slowing a little bit. So what's going on? Well, I guess the economic recovery isn't really matched by the increase in consumer confidence. Wages aren't going up fast enough, and of course there's the spectre of interest rates, which is always around the corner, and now we're told is going to be before the next general election in 2015 at the earliest. So that's part of the picture. The other part, of course, is the continued failure of some of the big retail chains. We haven't seen the bloodbath in 2014 that we've seen in some previous years, thankfully, but we've still seen some very big, high-profile failures. I guess the most recent example is Phones for You that went into administration in September. Probably the biggest and most sudden failure since Woolworths at the start of the recession. And I think that shows that structural changes in the market are still an extreme challenge to a lot of companies, and a recovering economy isn't necessarily going to protect you from that. And those companies in particular that over-leveraged too much before the recession just don't have the flexibility now to react to those changes.